Welcome back to Hand Sewing with the HTA. In this episode we're going to teach you pad stitching. Please take a look. So when it comes to pad stitching, I generally use a smaller needle. You could switch to a size 9 if you wished, or I generally use like a 6 sharp either. And now there's a couple of different types of padding. There's a padding for collars and padding for the lapels. It's essentially the same stitch. The only difference is that it's a little easier on the collar here. So on the collar you've got two layers. You've got your collar canvas and your melton. And what you're doing is you're shaping the collar while applying these two materials to one another. So when you're padding, what you're doing is you're keeping your finger behind and you're feeling how deep you're going into the cloth beneath it. So generally you don't use knots when you're doing pad stitching. So you're just needle in there like that, and then you're jumping down probably about half an inch minimum spacing there, half to 5/8. And then you see you're keeping your finger behind, and what you're feeling for is how deep you're going through the bottom layer. So you don't want to come all the way through it. All you want to do is you just pick it up, essentially splitting the fibre of the melton. Because the collar melton is actually quite thick, it's a lot easier to do this stitch, because you don't have to worry about going too deep. Now going too deep would be something like that, where you can actually see the needle coming through, and ultimately you'd see the stitch as well, or stitching it like so, where you're actually coming through the fabric, and then you can see the little blue stitches there underneath them. So it's we actually probably should use, I'll switch over to white on this, a bit easier to see. Switch it like that. So what you want to try and avoid doing is coming through in your stitches. Then what you end up with these big stitches then underneath that are clearly visible. So it's not just about how deep you go through the cloth. You know, you want to get in and just essentially pick up a fibre of that cloth underneath, so you're catching it, but you're not sewing through the stitches. All you should see of the stitches is just a little pull where the stitch is in, where it's caught the fabric but hasn't sewn all the way through. Whenever you're doing the padding stitch as well, you're generally rolling it like that over your fingers, and the idea of doing that is to create shape. Again, you're using your forefinger here. It's going to be right behind where the needle's going in, so you can feel how deep it's going, whether it's going all the way through or you're just picking up the fibre. So generally what I'm doing is I'm putting the needle in, finding the top of my finger, and then I'm drawing it back, pushing it forward. So I'm sort of going all the way through first when I feel my finger, then I draw back, and I push it, and I miss. You know, as you can feel that I'm not going so deep into the fabric, I'm not going all the way through the melton. Then when you're doing padding stitches, the other thing you tend to find in characters padding, you're doing interlocking stitches. So whenever you're coming back on yourself, your next row is coming up beside it, but it is halfway between the other stitches. So generally you start off with a half stitch, and then you've got your stitching between your last stitches there. Then when you get to the end, what you want to do is just give it a stitch. Again, you're holding it between your little finger or index finger like that, or drawing it through, and then we'll give it 2 stitches, and then we can cut it off. So it's the same flick of the wrist or flick of the little finger to put the tension in when you're closing any stitch. So that's the padding stitch on the collar. The lapel is no different. Now, well, it's no different, and then there's a big difference. The main difference between these two is the weight of these fabrics is a lot lighter than these. The canvas is a lot finer than the collar canvas. The cloth is a lot finer than the melting, so it does require more skill. Typically when I'm doing either of these two cloths, I actually use just regular machine cotton. I used to use hand silk, but I found that on lighter weight cloths, when you press the lapel, you could actually see the stitching, the indentation of the stitching coming through onto the lapel. So I didn't like that, so that's why I stopped. But the principle is still the same, it's just a lot harder. You know, like this is a very lightweight cloth. It's just so easy just to put the needle in and go all the way through the cloth. But you just want, all you're doing is you just want to pick it up, so you're left with a very slight indentation underneath. Now the things you can do to help yourself when you're doing this stitch is to either place a layer of cotton between the canvas and the cloth, or fuse it. I think I use in the video series the making of a Savile Row coat, we put cotton in here, and then I think on the ladies series we fused it. I can't really remember now, but there's always an extra layer going in there because this is just so fine. It's very hard for a person without any particular skills, or or has yet to master a needle and thimble, to get a stitch that's nice. So you can barely see it there. Then you can see here this it's being caught, it's catching there and there, and you can actually see I've actually dropped a stitch here as well. So that's it's very tricky to do it if it's very light. Now often what you will get most of the time is, I'm going to do it here, is where you dig a little deep, and you look underneath, you can just see the stitch. Now again, these stitches are blue on the black, so if I switch the white for that, Taylor's referring this to as ants crawling. You can see the stitches underneath. And it looks like ants crawling up. But just here like that. So we're going all the way through, but we're trying to leave the smallest stitch possible underneath. And that's what they call it there, ants crawling, where you've got these stitches. That last one's caught, it just didn't go quite as deep. With it, I'll put another one in. There we go, with a couple of more stitches there just showing through. So really, that's about as big as you want them. So let's see if I can do it here. So I'm catching, these other stitches are actually caught. So they are, they haven't been putting it deep enough for the demonstration. So, if you're not accustomed to hand stitching or to hand padding the lapels here, you're gonna go too deep. You are going to show stitches, but as I say, I'm struggling here to do it wrong. That there would be unacceptable, and that there would be acceptable. And what you're aiming for is, like, you can't really see it. So it's caught right there. You can see it when you push your fingers, it's catching it. But you can't see it. But invariably what you'll get is at least that type when you start off. And that's fine. I mean, like, you gotta your skill will get better as time goes on. As I say, my old master used to call it ants crawling up. And when you can see, you flip it over, there's ants crawling up your lapel here. And that's just because you could see where the stitch was coming through. But as I say, you should try and minimize as much as possible. I mean, the finer these fabrics are, the harder it is to pad it without showing the stitches. So like say putting a piece of fusing underneath it, a piece of pocketing there when you go to hand stitch, can make it a lot easier. But expect, even with those layers, that in the beginning you're going to be showing little stitches. As time goes on, you're going to get much better at it. It also depends on how much time you actually spend doing it. Like if you give more time to padding, like where you can really take your time and put in each stitch, spend like 45 minutes padding a lapel, you're gonna have much nicer stitches on it. But at the end of the day, if you're doing this to make money, you also have to weigh up how much time you're going to spend on it versus the quality you're going to get. I actually do know of tailors that like to see the stitching back here. And they're saying, oh, you can tell it's done by hand because, the stitch, you can see the stitches, they're, the distance between them isn't uniform and the depth isn't uniform either. When it's padded on a machine, you can set it so it doesn't go all the way through the cloth. All the stitches are very uniformed. And so it's easy, if a keen eye will be able to tell it's done by a machine. So generally people, so it's one of those two things. It's like, if it's done like this, it's done by hand. If it's done really well by hand, it could be mistaken for being done by machine. There we go. That is padding the lapel and the collar. Thank you for watching.